Guten Morgen, Studenten? Or is it Guten Abend where you are? I don't know, but wherever you are, let's continue to try to think about Taoism. And I want to do that in this video by thinking of the title of the book. The very title of the book is a finger pointing at the moon of the philosophy of the Tao. So let's think about that. So here's the original Chinese characters, and they're pronounced Dao De Jing. Now up here we have the earliest form of putting Chinese words into English, and here we have a later one, right? In your studies, you're liable to see either one, so I've got both of them here for you. But this is pronounced Dao De Jing. And people have struggled to translate this word Dao. If you go looking at different versions of the Dao De Jing, and you can easily find them online, you might find it translated as nature, reason, logos, truth, or even, and this is a funny one to me anyway, the undifferentiated aesthetic continuum. But the best way to translate it, it seems to me, is simply as way. And that begins to make sense if you think about the elements of the characters. If you know about Chinese characters, they're made up of little meaning bits, right? And there are three elements of meaning in this character. One's quite clear. It's a human foot, right? And this is a road. And here you have a sort of human head. And you have the idea that you have the head of a leader or a sage with a foot suggesting a follower united in finding their path. And this ancient ideograph is found as long ago as 11th century BCE. And it shows us how the Dao De Jing is a book of political and individual wisdom. The two go together, right? But it also relates in an individual sense to finding your own personal way of putting your foot down the path. Now, the idea of a way seems to be bound up with elemental human experience wherever we go. We seem to find this word, which suggests a sort of primal experience we all have of being on a way, being on a track, being on a trek, right? In a sense, we could call this a cross-cultural invariant signifier that makes up what Giambattista Vico called the common sense of the human race. We have these common ways of understanding, these archetypal patterns. And an archetypal pattern of being human seems to be the idea of being on a journey, of being on the way. If we look in the ancient Indo-European roots of the European languages, for example, we find dorg as way or movement, and then we find the Russian word for way and road, the Polish word for way and road, the Czech word for way and track, Croatian, right, path through a valley, Arabic, track, pathway, Norwegian, a trail, Sanskrit, a course, as in a water course, a course is a way. In English, we have track, trackway. In Hebrew, track, path, and way, right? This track or track, right? To follow the way is to be on a track or a trek. In fact, it seems this notion of being on a way, of being on a path or course through life, is a very basic way human beings have in thinking about what it means to live and be in the world. Now here's the second character. And as you can see, people have struggled to try to put it into English as well, right? Pronounced duh. Some people translate it as power, action, life, inner potency, indirectitude, which means moral uprightness, charisma, mana, or very commonly, virtue. But I think integrity is the best way to translate it, and to translate it as virtue would be a mistake for a reason I'll explain in a minute. But if you look at the elements of this character, it has three elements. It has footsteps with the idea of going. It has the symbol for being straight or upright, and in terms of heart-mind, your heart or your mind. These are really thought together in classical Chinese thought. The heart was thought to be the root of the mind, not the brain, but the heart mind, right? So going in an upright way with your heart mind, integrity. But why would it be a mistake to translate it as virtue? Well, the main reason is it's sort of drifted away from its original meaning, right? If I talk about somebody being virtuous, you're going to think of somebody who follows the rules, or you might even think, in Victorian times, they talk about women preserving their virtue, which would mean they wouldn't sleep with anybody, right? So if you're a virtuous person, you wouldn't sleep around, you wouldn't smoke or chew or run with those who do. You'd go to Sunday school or synagogue or your local atheist meeting, whichever one you wanted to. But virtue in its original sense, if you go back to the Old English, in English, virtus means something like strength, capacity, or power to do things. So immoral or evil people or even monsters could have virtus, right? It means they'd have the power to do things. And similarly in Greek, if you know the Greek language, arete is often translated as virtue, and that's not a good translation either. It should probably be translated as excellence, or maybe even integrity, because it sort of means excellence of functioning, resulting in power in the world, right? Which is very different from what we usually mean by virtues, or being virtuous. Right? So there's an ancient sense of virtue, but it's drifted away. So it's misleading to translate these words with virtue. And similarly, in ancient Chinese, we find the phrase evil de, right? And an evil virtuous person doesn't seem to make sense unless you see what it means. And a strong, powerful evil person who acts in a certain way to have effect in the world. So if we look at this ancient meaning of da, it has, in Chinese, it has to do with the quality, character, or personality resulting in a sort of personal strength and worth that has a real effect in the world. So in the Dao De Jing, it's referring to the personal qualities or strengths of the individual person or thing. It's sort of personhood or selfhood. It's self-so is the Chinese word. Everything has a self-so, a kind of nature that's its own way of Taoing, right? Da is like the microcosmic Taoing of the individual, which shows forth their characteristic way of being in the world, which has a certain effect or power. There's this idea that who you are is the result of all your actions, both good and bad. All that you do, every action results in who you are and gives you a certain force in the world. And some people seem to have more force to them, more weight in human affairs for good or ill. Behind the appearance of all things seeming basically the same is a reality of the self-nature in terms of what is real. Da is how the individual thing embodies Tao. It is the character of each thing in the universe. The da of the last thing you do in a long and complex process often is to be stubborn, for example. I think of a friend I worked with once named Rich, and we were working on this tractor for his father. And we'd taken the oil pan out and the engine apart, and we're finally putting it back together, and we're just about to get everything together and putting this one screw in, and it sort of slipped and went down into the oil pan. And then we had to take the damn thing apart we had to take the oil pan off to get the screw out, right? There's just this sort of there's this own character to things that they have and how they exist in each creature. Each object in reality has a da, which is its own way of sharing the way, and gives it its own sense of force or momentum, its character, right? Its own way of weighing. Contrary to what scientists tell us, nature is not uniform. The same objects in the same experiment act differently. And what does a scientist say? He calls it an anomaly and repeats the experiment, looking for an interaction with Da more to his or her liking. Each thing has its own way of being, its own characteristic integrity. And here's my definition of integrity. The characteristic way a thing holds together in completeness, as shown when under pressure or stress, and thus has a real force and effect in the world. An architect can ask, for example, what is the integrity of that structure? Like, what is the integrity of the Skyway Bridge? Or what is the integrity of the Siebert Classroom building? Can it stand under certain stresses, right? Or in a job interview, you might be quizzed on your character, your integrity. How do you act when faced with temptation, when placed under stress? Are you dependable and honest? Do you hold together in the way we're looking for? What is your characteristic way of being in the world? What is your Da? Now, Jing just means book, or like a classic, we say Plato is a classic text, a classic, right? A classic of Western literature, so classics of Eastern literature, and so on, or simply a book. But it's fascinating to think about the root meaning of this character, because it refers to the thread or warp of a fabric, right? And so book from threads running through to hold the manuscripts together, right? But then it has a sort of, by metaphorical extension, it comes to mean passing through, like a thread passes through, or like the warp passes through the fabric holding it together. And passing through also has within it the meaning of experiencing, right? So all those meanings are there too, though the simplest way to translate it would just be book. So if we think about our three characters here, these three fingers pointing at the moon, three lovely fingers pointing at the moon, we could translate it for ourselves. We could call it the Book of the Way and its integrity, or playing with the words, maybe threads of Tao and Da. I like threads of Tao and Da, right? Threads of the way and its integrity. But it's a book. It's a manuscript. It's a text. It's a classic. It's full of some beautiful and wonderful fingers pointing at the moon. So we're about to come to me what is the most interesting part of Taoism in my next lecture, which will be about the ethics of Taoism. So you have that to look forward to for next week, and then also a lecture on Zhuangzi. But for now, I'll let you read and study, and maybe start working on that essay on the Dao De Jing. Thank you for your kind attention.